This is my most memorable life lesson. That day. The nurse stood at the doorway with a clipboard pressed to her chest and said, "We can move forward as soon as we have the guarantor's signature." Her voice was calm, professional, as if she were asking for a pen, not the last thing standing between my daughter and the treatment she needed. I looked down at the papers in my hands. My name was already there. The doctor's notes were there. The insurance approval stamp sat neatly in blue ink at the top of the page. Everything had been approved, everything except that one line. "Isn't the insurance enough?" I asked. She shook her head gently. "Because of your current financial status, we need a secondary guarantor. Just as a precaution." A precaution. I nodded, pretending I understood while my chest tightened. My divorce was still being finalized. Assets hadn't been formally divided yet. On paper, I was in between lives, no longer married, not yet settled. I thought of my family immediately. I didn't panic. Not then. I truly believed this would be simple. Just hours earlier, I had been sitting beside my daughter's hospital bed, brushing her hair back as she slept. The room hummed softly with machines doing their quiet work. Her face looked smaller than it should have, paler than I was used to. When the doctor explained the treatment plan, I listened carefully. He was confident. The odds were good. We had caught it early enough. "You did the right thing bringing her in when you did," he told me. That sentence alone nearly brought me to tears. When he mentioned insurance approval, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I remember thinking, thank God. At least this part won't be a fight. I had no idea the real fight was just beginning. I stepped into the hallway and pulled out my phone. My father answered on the second ring. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I need a small favor." He listened as I explained. The treatment, the paperwork, the guarantor requirement. "I'm not asking for money," I said quickly. "Just a signature. It's temporary." There was a pause on the line. I could hear him breathing. Finally, he said, "I can't put my name on something like that at my age." I tried to explain again. Slower this time, carefully. "It's just in case," I said. "They don't expect any issues." "I'm retired," he replied. "I can't risk my stability now." His voice wasn't angry. It was matter of fact, like this was an obvious decision. "I understand," I said, even though something inside me cracked when I said it. I called my mother next. She listened quietly, as she always did. When I finished, she sighed. "Oh, honey," she said, "this is so hard." I waited. "But if something went wrong," she continued, "we could be tied to it. We just can't take on that kind of uncertainty." "I wouldn't ask if there was another way," I said. "I know," she replied softly. "But we have to be careful." "Careful?" I thanked her and hung up. My brother didn't even let me finish. "That's not my responsibility," he said. "You're the parent." "I know," I replied. "I'm just asking for backup." "Well, I'm not comfortable with legal entanglements," he said. "You'll figure something out." The call ended shortly after that. 3 conversations, 3 refusals, all polite, all reasonable, all final. I stood there in the hospital hallway, staring at the wall across from me. A framed photograph of a sunset hung slightly crooked. I remember noticing that detail, like my mind was looking for something small and manageable to focus on. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned. What hurt most wasn't the refusal itself. It was the speed of it. No one asked how my daughter was feeling. No one asked to see the paperwork. No one said, "Let me think about it." They had already decided. Later that evening, as I sat back in the chair by my daughter's bed, my phone buzzed with a message from my youngest sibling. "How's she doing?" it read. I hesitated before replying. Everyone in my family knew how things usually went. The youngest was always seen as unreliable, drifting, still trying to find their path. I typed back anyway. "She needs treatment. We're waiting on paperwork." A few minutes later, another message came through. "Do you need help?" I stared at that question longer than I should have. What my family didn't know, what none of them asked, was that my divorce had been ugly. My marriage hadn't ended quietly. My husband hadn't just fallen out of love. He'd been unfaithful for years. When everything finally came to light, the legal process that followed was slow and exhausting. Assets were frozen, accounts were scrutinized, everything took time. On paper, I looked unstable. In reality, I was surviving one long day at a time. The youngest showed up at the hospital the next morning. They didn't bring flowers, they didn't bring advice. They sat down beside me and asked how the paperwork worked. I showed them the form. They read it carefully, every line. This is all they asked. Yes, I said. But I understand if where do I sign, they asked. I looked at them, startled. You don't have to, I said. It's a risk. They nodded. I know. And you don't even have to decide right now, I added. They picked up the pen anyway. I'm deciding now, they said. When the nurse returned and took the signed form, I felt a rush of relief so strong I had to sit back down. The treatment was scheduled. The process began. What I didn't know then was how much that single signature would change the way my family saw each other, or how quickly their sense of security would be tested. Because while they had refused to take a risk for my child, they were already taking one for someone else. And I was about to find out. For a few days after the paperwork was signed, I lived in a strange state of relief mixed with unease. The treatment began as scheduled. Nurses came and went. Doctors spoke in careful, reassuring tones. My daughter complained about the hospital food and asked when she could go home, which felt like the best possible sign. On the surface, things were moving forward. Underneath that calm, something unsettled me. I couldn't shake the memory of how quickly my family had said no. Not argued, not hesitated, just no. My parents called that weekend to check in. My mother asked about my daughter's appetite. My father asked what the doctors were saying. Their concern sounded genuine, and maybe it was, but there was a careful distance in their voices, like they were relieved the problem had resolved itself without requiring anything from them. I didn't mention the guarantor. I didn't mention my youngest sibling. I let them believe everything had simply worked out. Good, my father said. I'm glad it didn't turn into something complicated. That word again. Complicated. A few days later, I learned something I hadn't been meant to know. I was at my parents' house dropping off mail when my mother asked me to bring in a folder from the car. As I set it on the kitchen counter, a stack of papers slid out. Loan documents, mortgage pre-approval forms. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. Dates, initials, notes in the margins. What's this? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. My mother froze for just a second. Long enough to tell me everything. Oh, she said lightly. We're helping your brother with something. Something. I flipped through the papers slowly. The numbers made my stomach tighten. They were co-signing a loan so my brother could buy a house. That evening I confronted my father. He's finally getting on his feet, my father explained. This could be his chance. You said you couldn't take risks, I replied. This is different, he said without hesitation. Different. How, I asked. He has potential, my father said. He just hasn't had the right break yet. I waited for him to hear himself. He didn't. My brother called me later that night. I hear you saw the paperwork, he said. I did. Well, he continued, this is an investment, not like medical stuff. I swallowed hard. You mean my daughter? There was a pause. I didn't say that, he replied. But he didn't correct it either. What struck me most wasn't the favoritism itself. It was how openly they acknowledged it. Helping my child was framed as a risk. Helping my brother was framed as opportunity. No one said it outright, but the message was clear. Some futures were worth gambling on, others weren't. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table long after the house was quiet, thinking about how often this pattern had repeated itself over the years. My brother had always been almost successful. Always one step away from something big. Always deserving of one more chance. My youngest sibling had been written off early, too sensitive, too unfocused, not reliable enough to bet on. And I had always been the steady one, the one who would manage, the one who didn't need saving. Until I did. A few days later, my parents found out who had signed the guarantor form. They didn't hear it from me. The insurance company called my father by mistake, confirming a detail on the paperwork. A clerical error. A simple call. A phone call that changed everything. My mother called me first. Her voice was sharp. "Why didn't you tell us your sibling signed that form? I didn't think it mattered," I said calmly. "You'd already said no." "That was irresponsible," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what kind of risk you put them in?" I waited. "You should have stopped them," she continued. "You're the older one." The irony almost made me laugh. My brother was worse. He accused my youngest sibling of being reckless, of trying to look like a hero, of dragging the family into potential trouble. "They don't even have a stable job," he said. "What were they thinking?" I asked him one question. "Where was that concern when you signed your loan papers?" He didn't answer. The criticism didn't stop. My parents lectured. My brother complained. They spoke about responsibility and judgment, all while ignoring the choice that had started it all. Not one of them said thank you. Not one of them asked how my daughter was doing. They were too busy being afraid. The youngest took it quietly. They didn't defend themselves. They didn't argue. They told me later I knew this would happen. That broke my heart more than anything else. Because it meant they had expected the blame. That night I lay awake thinking about how quickly compassion disappeared when consequences entered the room. My family had been willing to take a financial risk for a grown man chasing potential, but not for a child who needed treatment. And when someone else stepped up, they turned their fear into judgment. I didn't confront them then. I didn't need to. Life has a way of testing the logic people use to justify their choices. And my family's logic was about to be tested in ways none of us expected. Once I knew about the loan, I couldn't unknow it. It changed the way every conversation sounded. Every casual comment carried a second meaning, now one I hadn't been aware of before. When my father talked about being careful, I heard fear only when it applied to me. When my mother talked about family sticking together, I heard exceptions built quietly into the sentence. When my brother talked about working towards something better, I heard entitlement. Nothing had changed on the surface. Everything had changed underneath. I didn't confront them right away. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to lay the paperwork on the table and ask them to explain slowly how one signature was reckless, but another was an investment. But I was tired. My days were spent at the hospital. My nights were spent replaying conversations in my head. I didn't have the energy to argue with people who were convinced they were right, so I watched instead. My parents began talking more openly about my brother's new house. Not to me directly at first, but around me, loud enough for me to hear. They talked about the neighborhood, about resale value, about how proud they were that he was finally settling down. My mother showed me photos on her phone one afternoon while my daughter slept. "Isn't it lovely?" she said. "This could really change his life." I nodded and handed the phone back. Inside, something hardened. A week later, my brother invited the family over to see the place. I almost didn't go, but I wanted to see it for myself. The house was modest but clean, fresh paint, new appliances, a small yard that had clearly been chosen with potential in mind, not current reality. My father walked through each room like a man inspecting his own accomplishment. "This is a smart move," he said. "Once he gets back on his feet, this place will be worth more." I looked at my youngest sibling standing quietly near the doorway. No one asked them what they thought. On the drive home, my mother sighed contentedly. "Sometimes you have to take a chance on the right person," she said. I couldn't help myself. "And how do you decide who's the right person?" I asked. She glanced at me, puzzled. "You know, someone with direction." I let that sit between us. That night I thought about how often my brother's direction had been funded by someone else's patience. My parents had helped him before, covered a missed payment, smoothed over a bad decision, offered advice instead of consequences. Every time it was framed as belief in his potential. Every time it came with praise. A few days later, my youngest sibling came by to check on my daughter. They brought groceries, nothing fancy, just practical things. When my daughter fell asleep, we sat at the kitchen table and talked quietly. "They're excited about the house," they said, not bitterly. "Just observant." I know, I replied. They hesitated. I didn't know they were co-signing until after I signed your paperwork. I looked up sharply. You didn't. They shook their head. No. If I had known? You still would have signed, I said gently. They smiled just slightly. Probably. That smile held years of being underestimated. The truth came out fully a week later. Not in a dramatic reveal, in a casual slip. My father mentioned the loan payment schedule while complaining about interest rates. I asked how long the loan term was. He answered without thinking. That was when I realized the scale of it. They hadn't just helped my brother buy a house. They had tied their future to it. Something in me shifted then. Not anger, not resentment. Understanding. My family didn't see risk the way I did. They saw it through the lens of reward. Helping my brother came with the promise of pride. Helping my child came with uncertainty and fear. So they chose the option that made them feel hopeful, even if it meant walking away from something that mattered more. A few days after that realization, the insurance company called again. This time, everything went smoothly. My daughter's treatment was progressing well. No complications, no red flags. When I hung up, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. For a brief moment, I thought maybe this was as bad as it would get. I was wrong. The first sign came from my brother. He called late one evening, his voice tight. There's been a problem at work, he said. What kind of problem, I asked. A disagreement, he replied. With management. I said nothing. They're overreacting, he continued. I'll straighten it out. I had heard those words before. 2 days later, my mother called me in tears. He lost his job, she said. They let him go. I closed my eyes. The house that was supposed to be an investment had just become a liability. The loan my parents had been so confident about now hung over them like a storm cloud. And suddenly the word risk entered the conversation again. Only this time it wasn't about me. As I hung up the phone, I thought about timing, about how quickly certainty can turn into panic, about how the same people who had refused to stand beside me were about to ask for help themselves. They didn't know it yet, but the balance of the family was about to change, and so were the rules. The news of my brother losing his job didn't cause an explosion. It caused silence, the kind that settles in slowly and presses down on everything else. Conversations became shorter. Phone calls ended sooner than usual. My parents stopped talking about the house altogether, as if pretending it didn't exist might make the problem smaller. I knew better. Financial pressure doesn't disappear when you stop naming it. It waits. My youngest sibling found out the same way I did. A call from my mother full of worry but strangely careful, as if she didn't want to say the wrong thing. They're going through a tough patch, my mother said. Your brother needs time. My sibling listened quietly. Then they asked, what about the loan? There was a pause. We'll manage, my mother replied. It wasn't an answer. That weekend, my parents called a family meeting. Nothing formal. Just coffee at their kitchen table, the same one where so many decisions had been made without me over the years. My brother arrived late. He looked tired, defensive. His confidence had cracked, but it hadn't disappeared. My youngest sibling sat across from him, hands folded, expression neutral. No one mentioned the guarantor signature at first. They talked about the job loss, about unfair bosses, about how hard it was to find work these days. Excuses floated easily around the table. Then my father cleared his throat. We need to talk about responsibilities, he said. I felt my jaw tighten. He turned to my youngest sibling. You shouldn't have signed that paperwork, he said flatly. You put yourself and us at risk. My sibling didn't respond right away. That wasn't your place, my mother added. You don't even have a stable income. My brother leaned back in his chair. Honestly, he said it was reckless, trying to play hero. The room felt suddenly smaller. I waited for someone to mention why the signature had been needed in the first place. No one did. My sibling spoke calmly. You all said no, they said. Someone had to say yes. That doesn't make it right, my father snapped. It made it possible, they replied. Silence fell again. What shocked me wasn't the criticism. It was the complete lack of gratitude. Not for helping my child, not for taking on risk, not even for stepping up when no one else would. All they saw was danger now that it had a name. My mother rubbed her temples. "We're just worried about you," she said, as if that explained everything. My sibling nodded slowly. I know. That was it. No defense, no bitterness, just acceptance. I realized then how used they were to this role. After the meeting, my youngest sibling stayed behind while everyone else drifted out. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I didn't mean for you to take the heat." They smiled faintly. It's not new. That hurt more than anything my parents had said. In the days that followed, the tension grew. My parents began hinting that my sibling should undo the guarantor agreement somehow, as if responsibility could be reversed once fear set in. My brother grew irritable. Every conversation seemed to circle back to money, to pressure, to how unfair it all was. And through it all, my youngest sibling remained the easiest target. They were blamed for risking the family's future, while the loan that truly endangered it went largely unexamined. I watched this quietly, not because I agreed, but because I was learning something important. For the first time, I wasn't the one absorbing the family's discomfort. Someone else was, and the family didn't like it. A week later, my parents called me. "We may need help," my father said carefully. "With what?" I asked. "With covering things." "Just temporarily," my mother added quickly. They didn't mention my brother by name. They didn't mention the house. They didn't mention the loan. But the meaning was clear. I told them I needed time to think. That night I sat with my youngest sibling at my kitchen table. My daughter slept peacefully in the next room. Her treatment was working. She was getting stronger. I looked at the person across from me, the one who had been dismissed for years, who had stepped forward without fanfare. "I want to help you," I said. They looked surprised. "With what?" "With your life," I replied. "Not just this moment." They didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, they said, "No one's ever said that to me before." That was the moment I made my decision. Not about money, about loyalty, about who I would stand behind when things got hard. I didn't tell my parents yet. I didn't need to. They were about to learn that help like trust isn't automatic. It's earned, and sometimes it's redirected. My parents didn't wait long after that to call again. This time they were more direct. "We're falling behind," my mother said. "Just until your brother gets back on his feet." I pictured the kitchen table, the loan papers stacked neatly, the same table where my youngest sibling had been lectured about responsibility. "What exactly do you need?" I asked. My father cleared his throat. "Help with the mortgage payment." There it was. Not a request for advice, not a plan, just an expectation. I told them I'd get back to them. That evening I drove past my brother's house for the first time since his job loss. The lights were on. A car sat in the driveway. Everything looked normal from the outside. That's the thing about financial trouble, it hides well at first. I thought about how proud my parents had been when he got that house, how certain they were that it was the right risk to take, and how quickly that certainty had vanished. My brother called the next day. "I heard Mom and Dad talk to you," he said. "They did." "So?" He pressed. I took a breath. "I'm not covering the loan." There was a pause, then a short laugh. "You're kidding, right? I'm not." "You have money," he said flatly. The statement caught me off guard, not because it was true, but because of how easily he said it. "You don't know my situation," I replied. He scoffed. "Come on. You always land on your feet." That phrase again. I reminded him that he had refused to sign a guarantor form for his niece. "That's different," he said quickly. "How?" I asked. He didn't answer. When my parents heard my decision, the reaction was swift. My father accused me of holding grudges. My mother cried and said I was tearing the family apart. No one mentioned my youngest sibling. No one acknowledged the risk they had taken. Instead, the focus shifted to me, to my refusal. That was when the language changed. I was called selfish, cold, unforgiving. The same people who had spoken calmly about risk now spoke emotionally about loyalty. I listened. I didn't argue. Because something had finally become clear. In my family, sacrifice was expected, but only from certain people. When my youngest sibling sacrificed, it was foolish. When I was asked to sacrifice, it was duty. When my brother needed help, it was destiny. And when I said no, it was betrayal. I sat with that realization for a long time. Then I did something my family wasn't expecting. I helped my youngest sibling, not with speeches, not with promises, with action. We talked about what they wanted, not what the family thought they should do, not what they'd been pushed into. They wanted stability, a job that didn't disappear overnight, a place that felt like theirs. So I used my money quietly to help them enroll in a certification program they'd been putting off for years. I helped them update their resume, connected them with someone I knew through work. Within a month they had an interview, then an offer. I helped them find a small apartment close to their new job. Nothing flashy, nothing risky, just solid, safe. When they held the keys in their hand, they looked at me like they didn't quite trust that this was real. No one's ever invested in me before, they said. I smiled. Someone should have. My parents found out eventually. My mother called me, her voice tight. You helped them instead of us, she said. Yes, I replied. There was silence on the line. Then she said, after everything we've done for you, I thought about that. About the refusals, about the criticism, about the choices. I'm helping the person who helped my child, I said. I hung up before she could respond. That was when the anger peaked. Not loud anger, cold anger, the kind that turns into distance. I didn't chase them. I didn't explain myself again. I had already done enough explaining. And in that quiet space that followed, something unexpected happened. My youngest sibling began to thrive. They showed up to work early, learned quickly, built confidence. For the first time, they weren't waiting for someone else to decide their worth. They were earning it themselves. Watching that felt better than any argument I could have won. Better than being right. Better than being justified. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about choosing where my care went. And for once, it went to someone who would never treat it like an obligation. The house didn't save my brother. That was the first thing my parents had to accept. For weeks after I refused to help with the mortgage, they convinced themselves it was temporary, that he'd find another job soon, that things would stabilize if everyone just stayed calm. But reality doesn't respond to optimism. Bills kept coming. The bank didn't care about potential, neither did the utility company. And the silence from employers grew longer with each rejection email. My brother's confidence faded in small, visible ways. He stopped calling to brag about interviews, stopped offering explanations. When he did call, his voice was sharp, brittle, like he was holding himself together with effort. They don't get it, he told me once. They don't see what I bring to the table. I didn't argue. I had learned that trying to convince someone of their blind spots only made them dig in deeper. My parents, on the other hand, unraveled quickly. The stress showed in my mother's voice when she called, in the way my father's sentences trailed off halfway through thoughts. We're not sleeping, my mother admitted one afternoon. The payments are piling up. I pictured them sitting at that kitchen table again, staring at the same loan papers that had once filled them with pride. Only now there was no sense of accomplishment attached to them. Just fear. They asked me again for help. This time it wasn't framed as temporary, or reasonable, or fair. It was framed as necessity. We don't have many options, my father said. I asked what my brother was doing. He's trying, my mother replied quickly. It's just a bad market. I thought about how often bad market had been used to explain away his setbacks, and how rarely my youngest sibling had been given any explanation at all. When I said no again, the tone changed. My father accused me of being vindictive. My mother said I was punishing them. My brother stopped calling altogether. The distance settled in fully after that. Holidays passed quietly. Birthdays were acknowledged with short messages. The family rhythm I had known all my life fractured into something thinner, more cautious. I missed parts of it, but I didn't miss the pressure. One evening, my youngest sibling called me after work. I got a raise, they said, disbelief still woven into their voice. I smiled to myself. You earned it. They hesitated. Mom asked if I could help with the house. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. What did you say? I asked. I told her I couldn't, they replied. I'm just getting stable. I can't go backward. Pride washed over me. Not because they said no, but because they said it without apology. A few weeks later, the truth my parents had been avoiding finally caught up with them. The bank sent a notice, late payments, penalties, a deadline. They didn't show it to me at first. I found out through my brother, who called late one night, his voice raw. They're talking about selling, he said. The house, the symbol of his second chance, gone. What surprised me wasn't the loss. It was his reaction. For the first time, he didn't blame anyone else. I thought it would work out, he said quietly. I listened. I thought if they believed in me enough, it would. There was a long silence. I guess belief doesn't pay bills, he added. No anger, no excuses. Just truth. My parents sold the house a month later. They took a loss. The pride they had once wrapped around that decision dissolved into paperwork and signatures and quiet regret. They didn't ask me to help with the sale. They didn't ask my youngest sibling either. They managed it themselves. The family meeting that followed was smaller, quieter. No accusations, no demands. My father looked older than I remembered. We made choices, he said. Some of them weren't good ones. My mother nodded. She didn't cry this time. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't ask for money. They simply acknowledged the weight of what they had done. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. This wasn't a victory. It was an ending. As I drove home that night, I thought about how easily people confuse hope with responsibility. My parents had believed in the wrong things for the wrong reasons. They had called it love, called it support. But real support, I had learned, looks different. It shows up when it's inconvenient. It stands quietly when others walk away. And sometimes it means letting someone fall so they can finally see where the ground really is. After the house was sold, the family didn't fall apart. It simply rearranged itself. There were fewer calls, fewer assumptions. Conversations became careful, measured, like everyone was learning new rules at the same time. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding things together. And I didn't rush to fix that. My parents downsized quietly. They didn't complain about the smaller space or the change in routine. The loss of the house had taken something out of them, something beyond money. It had stripped away the illusion that good intentions could replace good judgment. My father stopped giving advice. My mother stopped offering explanations. When they spoke now, it was with hesitation, with awareness. My brother moved in with a friend for a while. He found part-time work, nothing glamorous, nothing that matched the future he'd once imagined for himself. But it paid his bills. We talked once over coffee. I never thought it would end like this, he said. I know, I replied. He looked at me, searching for something, sympathy maybe, or permission to be angry. I didn't give him either. What I offered was honesty. You were always given help, I said gently. You just never learned what it cost. He nodded slowly. That was all. Meanwhile, my youngest sibling's life moved forward in ways that still surprised them. They settled into their job, built routines, started planning beyond the next paycheck. One evening, we sat on the floor of their small apartment eating takeout straight from the containers. I don't feel invisible anymore, they said. I smiled. You never were. They shook their head. Maybe, but now I know it. I helped where it mattered. Not by rescuing everyone from consequences, but by investing in the person who had shown up when it counted. I paid off the remainder of the certification program, helped them build a small emergency fund, encouraged them to think about the future without fear. None of it was announced. None of it was used as leverage. It was simply done. My parents noticed the change. "You've grown closer," my mother said one afternoon. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated. "You don't help us the same way." "No," I said again. "I don't." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. For the first time, she didn't argue. What they still didn't know, what I hadn't told them, was the full truth about my divorce. The affair, the evidence, the settlement. When the papers were finalized, I had walked away with more than anyone expected. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I had been patient, thorough, and unwilling to settle for silence. Money doesn't heal betrayal, but it does give you choices. I used those choices carefully. I set up a trust for my daughter's future. I planned for my own retirement without assuming anyone else would be there to help. And I rewrote my will. It wasn't an emotional decision. It was a practical one. My daughter would be protected. My youngest sibling would be too, because they had proven without hesitation what responsibility actually looked like. When my parents eventually learned about the will, it wasn't through confrontation. It came up during a routine conversation with an attorney. A question asked, an answer given. They didn't protest. They didn't demand explanations. I think by then they understood. Family doesn't always mean equal. It means honest. It means accountable. It means knowing who will stand beside you when there's nothing to gain. Looking back now, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. I learned that help isn't something you owe simply because you share a name. It's something you choose based on values, not pressure. And sometimes the quietest choices are the ones that shape everything that comes after. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest moments, not erasing them, but softening their edges enough that you can hold them without bleeding. Months passed after everything settled. My daughter returned to school. Her strength came back slowly then, all at once, the way children seem to heal in leaps rather than steps. One day she needed help climbing the stairs. The next she was running ahead of me, impatient with my pace. Every time I watched her laugh, I thought about that piece of paper, that one signature, how close everything had come to stopping there. My life, too, grew quieter. The divorce was finalized without drama in the end. The infidelity had been documented thoroughly, and the settlement reflected it. I didn't celebrate the outcome. I didn't tell many people about it. I simply accepted it as what it was: compensation for betrayal, not a reward. The money gave me security. But more importantly, it gave me distance. Distance from fear. Distance from obligation. Distance from needing approval. My parents aged noticeably that year. Not in a dramatic way, just subtle shifts, slower movements, longer pauses before speaking, fewer assumptions about how things would turn out. We saw each other occasionally, polite visits, shared meals, careful conversations. They never apologized outright, but they stopped insisting they had been right. That was enough. My brother rebuilt his life in smaller pieces. He learned slowly that confidence without accountability doesn't carry much weight. We spoke now and then, not as rivals or favorites, but as two adults who finally understood each other's limits. There was no reconciliation scene, just acceptance. And my youngest sibling. They grew into themselves, not loudly, not dramatically. They saved, planned, showed up to work every day with a quiet pride that didn't need recognition. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the light fade, they said something that stayed with me. "I didn't sign that paper because I thought it would work out," they said. "I signed it because someone needed me." I nodded. That was the difference. I used to believe family meant shared risk. Now I know it means shared values. The people who matter most aren't always the ones who speak the loudest or promise the most. They're the ones who act when it costs them something, even when no one is watching. When I rewrote my will, it felt surprisingly peaceful. I wasn't cutting anyone out in anger. I wasn't making a statement. I was simply being honest. My daughter would inherit security, love, and the freedom to choose her own path. My youngest sibling would inherit stability, something they had never been given, but had earned in every way that mattered. It felt right. Sometimes late at night I think about how differently this could have gone. If my parents had said yes. If my brother had stepped up. If fear hadn't guided their decisions. But then I realized something important. If they had helped, I might never have learned who truly would. That signature didn't just unlock medical treatment. It revealed character. It showed me that generosity isn't about resources, it's about courage. That responsibility isn't about authority, it's about presence. And that the quietest people often carry the strongest sense of right and wrong. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever been told you weren't the safe bet, if you've ever stepped up while others stepped back, I see you. And I hope you see yourself more clearly now too. If this story made you pause, reflect, or recognize something familiar, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter more than you might think. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, difficult choices, and the lessons that stay with us long after the moment has passed, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening.